Tanshi Kiwa. Hello, how are you all? Welcome to Homelands, originally broadcast. Whoops, I didn't. Oh, there we go. On CFCR Community Radio, 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 Territory, CFCR.ca. This is your favorite auntie, Andrea Letting Dishnu Kashoon. My name is Andrea Letting. Call me Auntie Andy if you like, and I'll be your host over this next half hour. I am part settler, part relative, and 100% ally in relation to everyone. I'm just me, not a card-carrying member of any Indigenous nation, but I am loved, adopted, related to, and accepted by many, rejected by a few, haters gonna hate, relators gonna relate. I am blessed to have Indigenous relations in my family, and secretly I may love them just a little bit more than the rest, only because they are the first peoples of this land who welcomed all the guests. But I'm also Irish with some Scandinavian, along with some mystery, and that's the way I was raised, strongly anti-colonial and justice-oriented, with a big related heart for all. I most empathized with my Batoche Métis friends and family in that history and culture growing up, and as an adult have continued to try and live that Mio Pim Tisawin, that beautiful good life. So from the fringes of the sash, I situate myself as a relative and an ally, and welcome you, my listeners, as brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, cousins in the homelands. So let's welcome our relative tonight. So tonight we have my brother from another mother, my good friend Wilfred Burton, who is he's been an educator for a long time. He's now retired. He's an author of almost 10 books, I think. He's a fantastic jigger and teaches social dance. He's a volunteer in the community on many boards and many organizations. Gabriel Dumont Local 11. Saucy, the Open Door Society, and he does lots of crafting and creating as well. And so he gets a lot done, and he's a proud Métis man, and I'm very glad to know him. So welcome, Wilfred. Thank you for coming on tonight.
Well, that's quite an introduction, so thank you. So tonight I think I'm going to talk about my latest two books, which are a sequel. And so Rodelant's Kitten is the first one, and then the sequel to it is Rodelant's Kitten, Broken Promises. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how they came to fruition. Many, many years ago when I was teaching in Regina, I worked at an elementary school, and one of the TAs, her name is Mabel. Mabel was telling the story about how she had been relocated as a child from Lestock, Saskatchewan to Green Lake. And my little ears perked right up at the lunch table, and I zoomed over to the couch and I asked her a little bit more about it. And she usually wasn't very talkative, but that particular day she had a little bit of a captive audience. So she was a little more animated and a little more chatty. And so we had a great visit over lunch hour, and I just really appreciated her perspective on that story. I kind of knew the story a little bit, but I didn't know it as intimately as, of course, she had told it because she experienced it. So let's fast forward to a few years later. I'm working at the University of Regina in the SUNTEP program, and one of my colleagues and I were visiting one of the elders. His name is Isidore Pelche. He worked for the First Nations University of Canada, and we were over visiting him. And he too told the exact same story as Mabel. It was quite uncanny, actually. The details were pretty specific and pretty similar. And he also was a child at that time and was relocated from Lestock to Green Lake. So at the end of this, he said to the two of us, he said, "You two are educators, and this is a piece of our history that nobody knows about. And so if we don't tell this history, who is going to remember it or know it?" And so he said, you're educators, so I want you to tell this story because you're teachers, and just tell the story. So for me, I thought, wow, that's a really good honor, right? That's a great honor from somebody to tell their story. And, Isidore was not, he wasn't really old, but he was elderly, and he wasn't in that great a health. And he did have a position at First Nations University of Canada as elder, but I'm not sure if he told this story often. And that particular day, he wanted us to continue that story. So now let's fast forward a couple more years, or maybe even more, and I'm teaching an ed library course at the university to the SUNTEP students, and I had a student in my class. Her name is Sandy, and one of the assignments, she presented her mother's story, Marcy's story, and lo and behold, it's the same story. And so, which is quite coincidental. So by this time I'm going, this story really impacted a lot of people. And, so my head started churning, like how could this story be presented? And at that time I had published Fiddle Dancer, my first book, and Dancing in My Bones. So I thought, this could be a story. So during summer holidays, I sat down and sketched out a little outline of how the story would go. As I was sketching it out, it was really interesting because I thought, how can I engage children? Because I write mostly for children. How can I engage children in the story? Because it's not a happy story, and it's not that engaging for little kids. It's mostly engaging for adults. How can I pull them into the story? And because I love children's books and I've read gazillions of them over the years, I thought, I need something, a character, something that will pull them in. And then I remembered there were cats in the story. In 2 of the 3 stories, there were cats, and the cats came to not a good ending in either story. But I thought in my story, because I like cats, my cat in this story is going to come to a very good ending. So I started crafting the story around Kitten. And so that's how the first story sort of took place. Kitten was found in a shed by Madeline and Rosie, 2 little Métis girls who lived on the road allowance at Lestock. And they played with her and they had a great time. They shared her between the houses, and Kitten had a little quilt that she loved, and it went from house to house. But one day some men in suits came and told them that they had to get off their land by Saturday, that they would be taken to Green Lake. And so that's where the mood of the story changes significantly, from these happy little girls playing with a cat in the fields around their area, and all of a sudden they're being ripped away from their homes and being taken to Green Lake. Of course, Green Lake is full of bush and they come from the prairie. And so this is going to be a big move for them. So the rest of the story is about the anxiousness between the 2 girls and how they pack up, they go to Lestock, they get on the train, and how they smuggle Kitten onto the train so no one can see, because Mama and Papa said that she couldn't bring the cat. But they took the quilt and wrapped her up in the quilt and hid and got on and went to seats where the parents didn't see them and got the cat on the train. And so that's the end of the first story. And as they leave, they look back and they see that their houses are on fire. And that's historically correct. Most of the story is historically correct and it's an account, but it is a work of fiction. And in order to draw in children's attention, I made it a work of fiction. So then the very first time I read the story in public at the book launch in Regina at Walker School, the very first question that came out was, well, what happened to the people in Kitten when they got to Green Lake? Like, what happened? And so right then and there, we knew, Gabriel Dumont Institute and I both knew that there needed to be a sequel to this story. So Gabriel Dumont Institute was the one that published the first story. And so, yes, they decided that there would be a second story. So having that task at hand, I'm going, I need to know, I need to continue the story. And I did know the rest of the story of how it happened, or what happened to that particular family. I wanted them to not stay in Green Lake, and I wanted them to take a trip back south because the south was their home. And that's the home that they loved. And that's where their relatives were. And so my story that I'm fictionalizing, they did move back south. However, many Métis people didn't, and they stayed in the north, or they relocated to other urban centers or small towns or villages. And so that's kind of how that took place. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just read Rodelant's Kitten, Broken Promises, and then I'll continue talking about it after. Meadow Lake, hollered the conductor, gather up your things. Wanishka Kitten, wake up, it's time to get off this rattly old train, whispered Rosie as she swept the calico cat into her arms. Take good care of that beautiful cat, shouted the conductor as Rosie stepped down from the train. And there at the bottom of the stairs were crowds of strangers staring at them. And amongst the crowd, there were the men in suits. Rosie and Madeline immediately hid behind Mama. Pitch your tents along the edge of town, the men in suits yelled. You'll go to Green Lake in a few days. Rosie emerged the minute they left and began helping Mama collect their things while Papa unloaded the horses and wagon. She wondered what their promised land in Green Lake would be like. Va-t'en, Rosie sputtered. What are those pesky little critters flying into my mouth? Oh, they're just fish flies, said Papa. They won't hurt you. The horses, swishing their tails wildly from side to side, didn't like them one bit either. The bugs didn't bother Kitten, though. They were just one more moving thing to chase. 2 days later, everyone set off for Green Lake. Long stretches of road made of logs kept the wagons from sinking into the mud and muskeg. It was so bumpy that Rosie had to hold Kitten tightly so the frightened cat wouldn't jump off the wagon. There's a corner road is going to take my teeth out, chattered Papa. My bones are gonna break, stammered Rosie. That was the only laugh they had that day. Upon arrival in Green Lake, they found out their land wasn't surveyed. They had to set up camp again, and it didn't take long for everyone to get restless. What's going on? Asked Mama. We can't live like this forever. There's nothing here for us. I want to go back home, whimpered Rosie. Please, Papa. Be patient, my girl, responded Papa. I'll try and find out what is going on. Tell them we don't want any more fish dumped on the ground, added Mama. We aren't dogs. Rosie was sad. She missed the flat, treeless prairie with big blue skies. She missed her cozy little house on the Rodelants where she spent her days doing fun things. In the south, they didn't have to rub axle grease on the horses' open sores caused by the horseflies or live in tents. She longed to go home. Kitten didn't have a worry in the world. She spent most of her days stalking ground squirrels. She'd wait for the cheeky little rodents over one hole, and a few seconds later, they'd pop up in another. It was a fun game for the ground squirrels, but frustrating for Kitten. One day, Papa and Uncle finally met with the men in suits. They'll take us out to the land in a couple days and show us where we're going to live, Uncle announced. Days passed before they got to see the promised land. What's wrong, Papa? Asked Rosie as he and Uncle returned. By the look on Papa's face, he was not pleased. They nailed boards with our names onto the trees to show us where we'd be living, but they still aren't finished surveying. There's just bush and mosquitoes and nothing but broken promises. Mama asked one of the ladies in town about school for us, added Rosie. They only have room for their own kids. Another broken promise, exclaimed Papa. There is nothing here for us. Let's go back home. Now, this was music to Rosie's ears. She grabbed Madeline's hand and did a happy dance. The next day, they were on the move. They didn't know exactly how to get back, but they knew where the sun came up and where it went down. They knew where the North Star was in the sky, and that is how they would navigate home. The first day they headed south of Green Lake. Wherever they looked, there was bush as far as you could see. Every time they stopped to rest the horses, Rosie and Madeline let Kitten explore. Watch Kitten, warned Mama. You don't want her to get eaten by bears. It wasn't a problem because Kitten was a little bit of a scaredy cat. She stuck close to the girls. Papa motioned for the other wagon to stop. Let's stay here for the night. There's plenty of grass and water for the horses and shade for our tents. Look at all those berries, Rosie shouted. Don't go far, girls. Where there are berries, you'll find bears, warned Mama. Papa and Uncle went off to see if they could get a partridge, rabbit, or a deer for supper. The land provided for us, Papa said upon his return. The second day on the road, they spotted a cabin, and sure enough, it was the home of a Mitchell family. There were some kids and an orange tabby cat named Tommy. Everyone got along well, even Kitten and Tommy. That night, the trapper played his fiddle, his wife played a squeeze box, and Uncle played the spoons. Everyone danced around the fire. This is just like back home, laughed Rosie. The trapper needed help fixing his cabin, so Papa and Uncle helped. In return, he gave them some flour, dried meat, and directions. With spirits high and a route in place, they struck off just after sunrise. They were full of purpose and hope. The next evening, there were fewer trees with small grain fields here and there. They decided to go off-road for the night. It was dusk when they got the tent set up and supper started. All of a sudden, they heard shots. Bang, bang! Within seconds, 2 men mounted on spirited horses rushed into camp. Quick as jackrabbits, Rosie and Madeline scrambled into their tent. What are you doing here? Roared one man. Who gave you permission to set up camp? Yelled the other. We're going south, replied Papa. We need a place to camp for the night. Not on my land. Well, we don't want any trouble, exclaimed Papa. We'll leave in the morning. No, you'll leave right now, demanded the man. Quickly, the horses were hitched to the wagon and the tents loaded. Be on your way and don't come back, shouted the men. So from then on, they traveled at night and stayed off the main roads. They didn't want any more trouble. After a few days, they got to the South Saskatchewan River and found a nice spot to camp by the water. It was close to the ferry crossing. After a good night's rest, Papa and Uncle decided to try and find some work nearby. When they returned, Papa announced, we can make some money picking rocks and roots for a farmer for about 3 days. Rosie and Madeline got excited. Oh, now we have time to go and explore. Don't go far and keep out of the water, reminded Mama. Kitten is tied up, Rosie called as she and Madeline scurried off. Let's skip rocks on the water, suggested Madeline. We can make boats out of sticks and watch them sail away, added Rosie. And after a while, they heard Mama calling and they rushed back to camp. The first thing they noticed was a loose rope. Where's Kitten? Questioned Rosie. I don't know. I thought she was with you, said Mama. Oh no, shouted the girls in unison. Kitten, 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 they hollered as they frantically searched behind bushes and rocks. Shh, yeah, whispered Rosie. Kitten hates dogs, answered Madeline. Let's go. Sure enough, there was Kitten up in a tree with a dog below, tail puffed and back arched. Kitten was an impressive sight. The dog was tail wagging happy and ran towards the girls. Just then a boy broke through the bushes shouting, "That's my dog. What's he barking at?" "Our cat is up that tree," cried Madeline. "She is scared." "Oh, my dog won't hurt her. He just wants to play," announced the boy. "Well, I don't think she'll come down with a dog barking at her," said Madeline. The boy got the hint and left with his dog. "How will we ever get her down?" asked Rosie. They waited and waited for Kitten to come down on her own. At the end of the day, Mama brought them bannock sandwiches and a sealer of water. "You can't stay here all night," she told them. They tried bribing Kitten with food, then dangling a feather and singing, "Kispin, Kisaki again." Nothing worked. It was getting dark when Papa and Uncle came back from working in the fields. "I'll put you on my shoulder, see if you can reach her," Papa proposed. Papa stood beside the tree and hoisted Rosie up. Immediately, Kitten jumped onto Rosie. Yay! The next day, they got back on the road. After days and days of traveling, in the hot sun, the skies darkened and a blustery wind blew in. "A terrible storm is coming," Mama yelled. "Let's drive the horses down into the valley along the lake quickly." Uncle called out, "Pull the tent canvas from the wagon and crawl under it. There is no time to put it up." Hobble the horses, screamed Papa above the roar of the wind. Kitten did not like this display of lights one bit. When the thunder cracked, she bolted. We have to find Kitten, wailed Madeline as they rushed around getting soaked to the bone. She's under here, shouted Mama as they all quickly huddled under the canvas. They waited out the storm. Kitten batted at the string while they played cat in the cradle. They sang songs and told stories until the wind died down. After the big storm, Papa went to hitch the horses. They must have been spooked in the storm and wandered away. We need to go find them. Hours later, Rosie and Madeline saw their fathers coming over the ridge. Papa told the story. We asked a farmer if he'd seen the horses, and he recommended we look for them in the pound. That's where we found them. It cost $16 to get them out. Now we have hardly any money left. They traveled for many more days, and finally one evening they could see Regina in the distance. We'll camp here along the creek. Tomorrow we'll go to the city and see if we can find any of our relatives, said Papa. After the tent was set up, Rosie noticed the kitten didn't want to roam around or play, not even with the cheeky gophers. She just wanted to snuggle under her quilt. Is Kitten sick? Asked Rosie. I think she's just tired from her long journey, Mama assured her, just like all of us. So the next day, the horses and wagon were sold. Uncle Isidore from the city came with his truck and loaded up the rest of their belongings. Mama and Auntie rode in the cab of the truck, and the rest got in the back. I'll take Kitten inside, said Mama. She isn't used to the truck, and she might decide to jump off and run away. Rosie agreed. When they got to the city, they were happy to see their relatives. Auntie Marcy made boulettes and bangs to celebrate. It was so nice to be inside a house away from those annoying mosquitoes and horseflies. The next morning, Kitten could not be found anywhere. Kitten, Kitten, hollered Rosie and Madeline as they raced around the house trying to find her. Where can she be? Wailed Rosie. This cat is going to be the death of me, huffed Madeline. What's all the commotion? Asked Auntie. Kitten is missing, sobbed Rosie. Well, she has to be inside because no one's been out yet, exclaimed Auntie. Let's look under the bed. Auntie knelt down and peered underneath. Shh, come look. Looks like you got here just in time. There, snuggled in a box, was Kitten with 5 little fur balls and 1 calico just like her. And so that's the end of the story. And when I did the end of the story, I had many different endings in the drafts, but finally I thought, you know what? Kitten is the generation of the next cats, has to be the metaphor, I guess, for the resilience of the Métis people that endured that relocation that was promoted by the government. So that's why Kitten had babies at the very end of the story. The gestation period of a cat is, I don't know, 60 plus days, maybe 64 days. And so that's what, when I wrote the story, that's how long I wanted the trip to take, would be around 64 days. So that would be 2 months, right? And so actually we had a really good question from one of the kids that I, in one of the schools that I read to recently. The child asked, how long did it take? And so I told them, and they thought, well, it really couldn't take that long, right? It's not that far, but actually it is really far. So I said, you have to picture having a team of horses and a wagon and children, and going from Green Lake to Regina is a very long trek, and they probably could do 20 miles a day if it was a good day. But they also had to stop along the way to rest, to work, to get some money. They traveled at night, which would be slower than during the day because you have to navigate differently. So there was a lot of reasons why it would take that long. And so anyway, the child was happy at the answer in the end. I didn't tell him it was because of the gestation period of a cat, because by the time they visited the Mitchell family with Tommy, till the time they got to Regina, there had to be so many days in between. So yeah, so when I wrote this, a lot of the facts are true. They did rub axle grease on the horses because the horse flies were so brutal and they didn't have anything else, right? So if you put axle grease on, then the bugs couldn't bite through. And even though I don't think it's a disinfectant, but it would close up the wounds and the bugs wouldn't keep biting or be attracted to that spot. They did encounter storms along the way, so I added that to the book. They did encounter very hostile settlers that did shoot at them. They did travel at night because during the day was way too dangerous and they were just scared. They wanted to get home safely and they didn't want any more altercations. So there were lots of instances in this story that were factual, even though it was pieced together as a piece of fiction. The true story is that some people, when they did get to the Regina, they found their relatives in shacks by the dump, because that was where squatters could squat without getting into too much difficulty. And so I didn't put it in the story, but that is was the destination, was another sort of shack that was constructed. And they did stay there until they got jobs and were able to feed their families. If you think about the Southern Michifs, they worked during the summer really hard for farmers, picking rocks and roots and planting crops and harvesting crops, and a lot of the intense labor jobs. And then when they were taken away from that, they couldn't earn. There was no earning to be done when they got to the north, because they were supposed to be put on 40 acres of land when they got there, but it wasn't ready. So, and it was all bush. And, so how can you break some land to, prepare a garden when it's the middle of summer? You can't plant seeds in August in that far north. So the whole plan was a botched scheme right from the very beginning and wasn't very well thought out. There were quite a few Métis farms in Saskatchewan at that time, and Green Lake did have a Métis farm, and it was the intention was to train Métis men to become farmers. And so the Métis farm was there. There was one at Lebret, quite a famous one at Lebret. There was one in Baljenny, Willow Bunch, Glen Mary. There were quite a few around. Some of them were disasters right from the beginning and didn't last very long. And some of them did last a few years. Like the Lebret one actually was in existence when I lived in the South. And it still is there, but I think the land is rented out now to other farmers. But it's, it's kind of a testimonial of mechanization, because farmers became more mechanized in the South earlier. So this story took place in 1939, but people were buying tractors and that sort of thing. They needed less man labor. As you go further north, mechanization didn't happen as quickly. So I have a little personal story about road allowance. When I went to school, I was in grade 1. There were 39 children in our little school in grade 1. And so that's, quite a lot of children for one class. And there was a very large percentage of children that were Métis. They lived on the Midnight Lake Road Allowance and Jack Pine Road Allowance, and on the edge of town, just wherever they could squat, sometimes even in houses that had been abandoned. And so there were quite a lot of families, and of course they were all your friends and you knew them. And I think it was grade 5 or 6, I can't actually remember. In the summertime, I lived on a farm, so I didn't see anybody in the summer. I was fairly isolated. But in the fall, when I went to school, I get to see everybody again, and got to our class, and we were down to 21 children, and all just about all of the Métis kids that lived on the road allowance were moved. So it took that many years for the government get to central Saskatchewan to evict them from the road allowances up there. So it took quite a number of years for that to happen. And by the time they got up to Midnight Lake, they just said, get off the road allowance. Go find your way somewhere else. And so a lot of the people that lived there moved into either North Battleford or moved over, to bigger Outlook, Cando, that area, because that's where they could find some employment, like working for farmers, or if there was some industry or something that they could make a living. So it's a really sad part of our history. It's not a really well-known part of our history. I think it's becoming a little more well-known because more people are talking about it. But yeah, it's that part of the history. It's very interesting. I read this book or the first book at the Gordon Oaks Red Bear Student Center at the University of Saskatchewan. And one of the ladies that was there, she had a slightly different story. So her family was from the south, not from Lestock, but from another road allowance community in the south. And they too were relocated to Green Lake. But what happened was they got a ride, they hitched a ride because not everybody in the family wanted to leave. And they hitched a ride to Big River, I think it was, or somewhere over there. And they caught the bus and they ended up in Saskatoon, which is kind of interesting, right? And they left the grandpa in Green Lake, and he stayed there for the rest of his life and died up there. But the grandma and the little girl, who she was the caretaker of this little girl, they ended up in Saskatoon, and that's where they stayed, and that's where the grandma died, and that's where the little girl grew up and has a life now. So I found the stories are varied, but there's a common thread throughout all of the stories because it was basic survival, right? It was, they felt they couldn't survive at Green Lake. The part of the story where the little girl says, Rosie says, they told us that there wasn't room in the school here either. There's just room for the local kids. Actually was true because the people of Green Lake, even though they were Métis, they had their own community and they had everything established for themselves. And then this influx of Southerners come, right? And so it's really kind of interesting. They kind of said, this is what we have. We don't have very much, and we don't have room for you in the school. So I found that really interesting. And then at another event where I was reading a story, the first story, someone said that their family had to sell everything because they couldn't, they had brought a wagon full of stuff up with them, but in order to survive, they had to sell almost everything that they had to local people in order to just survive. And so that's why they ended up being just extremely poor and leaving the area and starting from square one, from scratch. So as I read the story, I hear more and more stories about that. I'm incredibly fortunate because my grandfather and grandmother, they took scrip, but with their scrip money, they purchased a homestead. And they didn't lose their homestead, which was quite common back then. A lot of people, through various reasons, lost their money or their homestead. And so then they become landless as well. But my grandfather was quite savvy, I guess. And so he decided that he would take land at Midnight Lake. He wanted to be a rancher, and Midnight Lake had beautiful, beautiful hay flats, like hay fields, like natural hay fields, and some bush. There was good hunting. There was good fishing in Alina Lake, like it was close by. it was really a little paradise up there for them. And so we actually, my grandma and my grandpa both took scrip and they purchased land. And they stayed there for their entire married life and raised their children. That's where my mother was raised. And so my mother was raised, even though it was tough at times. They always talk about the poor Métis and the dislocated Métis, but I'm really fortunate that my mom's story is quite different. They still had to work in the relief gangs building the highway to Meadow Lake, and they still had to do lots of different things to make a go of it. But that little piece of land that they had, they could raise cattle, pigs and chickens or whatever, have a garden, have 40 acres of oats so that they could feed the horses and whatnot. And they survived and in the end did quite well. It's really interesting today. I was just reading something about someone had posted something about the settlers that had made a name for themselves in an area, but there's no mention of the people that were there before them, right? And so like my grandpa and grandma, they homesteaded, they knew how to live off that land, and they were homesteading just like lots of the settlers were homesteading, but lots of the homesteaders didn't have a clue how to live off the land, and so they helped them. But in the end, when they wrote the local history book, they didn't ever mention that. They didn't mention that somebody helped them find medicines, helped them deliver babies, helped them put up hay in a good way, the right way. All of those things that are necessary for survival, they just didn't mention it at all. So, which is quite interesting, right? It's a selecting history and whatnot. So that's why I like to write historical fiction, because it tells people about a piece of history that kind of might be missing in literature today.
Thank you so much, Wilfred. Kishimasi to our relative tonight. So Niwag Maganak, all my relations, and believe me, we are all related. So act like you've got relations. Thank you to Wilfred Burton tonight for sharing with us. This is Auntie Andy signing out from Homelands, originally produced on CFCR Community Radio, 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 Territory, cfcr.ca. You could find excellent programming on Indian and Cowboy podcasting. Follow us on Twitter at Métis Homelands, or if you have comments, questions, or guest suggestions, email métishomelands@gmail.com. This episode will also be listenable on our YouTube channel, but not viewable at Homelands, so subscribe today. Marcy, thank you for listening, and Akoshi, Kawapa Mitino Waumina. That's all. We'll see you later.